From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden drops his bid to run for re-election and endorses Vice President Kamala Harris. Democrats quickly moved to endorse the vice president, and her possible opponents seem to be rallying behind her one by one. On today's edition of Potomac Watch, we'll talk about all the weekend's historic turn of events in the presidential race, what it means for the Democratic campaign, what Kamala Harris brings to the race, strengths and weaknesses, and how Donald Trump and the Republicans will respond. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, here with my colleagues Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. So just not enough news around, folks.
So boring, Paul.
Just, don't know what to write about these days. Well, it did finally happen. Joe Biden recognized, I think, the reality that he was headed for defeat against Donald Trump, and that his fellow Democrats were pushing him out of the race and were likely to ratchet up the pressure in the coming days and withdraw. As the old line has it, the pain was inevitable, but the suffering was optional. And he chose to reduce the suffering by finally getting out. And he called it in the best interests of the country in his statement. Let's listen to Kamala Harris, as vice president on Monday, praise the president.
And I wanted to say a few words about our president. Joe Biden's legacy of accomplishment over the past 3 years is unmatched in modern history. In one term, he has already, yes, you may clap. In one term, he has already surpassed the legacy of most presidents who have served 2 terms in office.
I want to get into that point Harris is making about Biden a little later. But Kim, was this the right decision by Biden?
Yeah, it was the right decision. Everyone who has watched him, I think not just in that debate, but over the past few years have had grave doubts about his ability to fulfill this term, much less a second one. And Democrats, I think, will bear some responsibility for covering that up and pretending that wasn't the case for a long time. But apparently what really did push the president over the edge were a couple of things. Reporting is that on Saturday, the results came back in from some internal battleground polling that the campaign itself had done. And some of President Biden's closest advisors, including Steve Ricchetti and Mike Donilon, came and presented, and they essentially said, you have no path for victory anymore. So I think that sunk in. Also, the realization, and it was communicated to the president, that Nancy Pelosi was intending to organize for a huge number of Democrats to publicly come out on Monday and call for him to go amp up the pressure. As one person told, I think it was Politico, she said, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. She'd given him the easy way for 3 weeks. Now came the hard way. And in the face of that extraordinary pressure and the polls showing that he was losing this both in terms of momentum, but just flat out the polling on the ground, I think that's what decided the president in the end.
Thus my point that the pain was inevitable from Pelosi. The suffering was optional. It's amazing in politics and in life, I guess, how quickly people are willing to move on. And Democrats are already rushing to endorse Kamala Harris. It's quite extraordinary. Bill and Hillary Clinton did so. Joe Biden, of course, did so. Members of Congress, all 50 state Democratic parties are now behind her. The possible competitors to her, often mooted, Gavin Newsom of California, Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, they and others, Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, have all endorsed her, knowing they don't want to take her on. So far, the exceptions are Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi. But it doesn't look to me, Kyle, as if they're maneuvering behind the scenes to pick someone else. It looks like this is Kamala Harris by virtually acclamation.
That last point, I think, is the important one. I would add also Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, both individuals who had been mooted as potential competitors if Democrats got into a situation where they had an open convention. And some of this, I think, is they're following the lead of President Biden himself, who, after withdrawing, said that he was endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris. She had been a good vice president, a good pick for him, and would be the right standard bearer going forward. And so I think that some of this is just the party following his lead. And remember, these delegates that are going into the Democratic convention in August are Biden delegates. And so there may be some sense on their part that they are going to follow what he says is the best option. And also, Biden may have just decided that having an open convention would be too messy, too unclear, and the best path forward, in his view, seems to be to elevate Kamala Harris as the standard bearer kind of by acclamation, as you say.
Yeah, it's not surprising, I guess, when you think about the calculation by the Democrats only a month or so before their convention, less than a month, I guess, before the convention. And this is an extraordinary turn of events where you're changing nominees so late in the race. I can't remember one. I mean, the closest thing is LBJ. In March of 1968, that was well before the primaries were even close to being done. Here you have the change so soon before the convention. A lot of Democrats want to just calm everything down. They don't like the uncertainty. They don't want any internal fighting. They're frustrated that the last 3 weeks have been all focused on Democrats and Biden. They want the focus to be on Donald Trump again. And so they're rallying behind Harris. And the other thing is, Kim, when you think of a Gavin Newsom or you think of a Josh Shapiro, you think of Pritzker, all of whom, they got in the back of their minds ambitions to be president. I think there's a reasonable calculation that says, you know what, even if I say that I will challenge Kamala Harris, I'm likely to lose this year. And if I do, but then she goes on to lose, I'll get blamed in part for it, for challenging her. And of course, a black woman candidate, first black woman vice president, is it the better part of political discretion to say, all right, it's all yours. I'm backing you 100%. And then if she loses, you're there in 2028 to run without having hurt your candidacy.
Yeah, that's right. Look, it's both rational and it's smart, especially if you factor in there what is now the next huge guessing game, although one that Democrats are embracing as somewhat exciting and could be an optimistic thing for that campaign, which is the Veep stakes, right? So many of these people come out. They are auditioning, as it were, for her to take them on the ticket. Even if she loses, they can say, well, I wasn't at the top of the ticket. Here I am. I've been introduced to the nation. That much more running room when you get to 2028, even if this doesn't fail. That's a very different prospect from being at the top of the ticket and losing and then bearing the blame for that. So I completely see the idea behind this. What Democrats want to do is pretend nothing just happened over the past month. And we just turned on a dime. We now have a new candidate. Everybody be all in for Kamala. We're going to have lots of enthusiasm going into the convention. And they're going to get a lot of help in that regard, Paul, from the press. You can already see it happening. I would be surprised nobody's going to want to talk about Joe Biden at all from now until November. This is all the attention is going to be focused back on Donald Trump. Interestingly, I will just point out there was a group of Democrats that have not endorsed her right away. And those were some of those that are in competitive races in swing states, for instance, like a John Tester, but also a lot of the Democrats that are challenging Republicans, incumbent Republicans in the House. And I think that is down to a little bit of a worry about being seen to having deposed your current candidate, pushed him out of office, and then crowned a new one. There is some sensitivity to the notion that voters might not like the way this process is playing out.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Kamala Harris as a candidate when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kyle Peterson and Kim Strassel here on our Potomac Watch podcast. So this rush to endorse Kamala Harris is on. There is also, I think, what I would call a relief rally among Democrats, a Wall Street term. The idea being, gosh, finally Joe Biden has left, that uncertainty is broken. Now we can all get behind the vice president. You see new enthusiasm. You see money flowing in, a lot of money. You see the party going to unify. Kim made the point that the press is all going to get behind her and her running mate. And the press, which has spent weeks criticizing Democrats, will now find new great reservoirs of talent, hidden reserves of political skill and experience. And look, she has a chance to reintroduce herself to the public, Kyle. I think you're going to see her talk about a new generation. She's 59, Donald Trump's 78. Let's look ahead. This is about the future, and let's not return to the past. As Kim said, try to forget about all this recent unpleasantness with Joe Biden. She'll do better with women voters, I think. She'll pick up a lot of more enthusiasm with younger voters. She probably does better than Biden with minority voters. Biden was losing an awful lot of support with blacks and Hispanics. She might pick some up there. And if she picks a white male VP from a swing state, say, she can make this a race.
I think that may be exactly right. One quote that has been making the rounds again was Nikki Haley in January, arguing that here it is, the first party to retire its 80-year-old candidate is going to be the one who wins this election. And I think there is something to that. Kamala Harris's biggest asset here is that she is not Joe Biden and she is not Donald Trump. Donald Trump's approval rating is about 10 points underwater in the Real Clear Politics average, and it was always that way throughout his entire presidency. And so she has an opportunity to make the case that she is the alternative for people who are the so-called double haters, the people in this election who did not want to vote for either Biden or Trump. It was a pretty sizable share of the electorate, if you believe the polling. The biggest weakness that she has is it is not clear, to me at least, what she stands for, what she's going to pitch herself as. The Donald Trump campaign will no doubt try to tie her to Biden's record, say that she was named by President Biden as the immigration czar. Well, how did that go over the last 3.5 years? She is responsible for the Biden inflation, argued for all of the stimulus spending and so forth. And maybe she can do kind of a bit of a turn back toward the center, particularly if she picks a moderate from a red or purple state to be her vice president, somebody like Andy Beshear. Maybe she can try to pivot and say things like, I was a former prosecutor. We have people that are crossing our border and breaking the law, and we can't stand for that. And I'm going to be stronger on this than Joe Biden. And yet I'm also not going to deport 15 million people like President Trump is talking about doing. The question, though, is to what extent she can pull that off, what her instincts are. It seems like she's always seen herself as pretty progressive. And if she tries to put some distance between herself and Joe Biden might feel the need to come out and say something about that.
He's going to keep quiet and help her however he can, because he knows his legacy is in significant part dependent on her winning. But I want to explore, Kim, this parts about her vulnerabilities. And let's start with a clip here that Republicans are already running about her as the border czar.
Warning. The following may upset liberals who don't want voters to know the truth about Kamala Harris.
If you ever wondered how Joe Biden could get the border so screwed up, remember, he had help. Here's Biden appointing Kamala Harris to be his border czar to deal with illegal immigration. And here are a record number of illegal immigrants, 10 million and counting, flooding over the border after Harris was put in charge of stopping illegal immigration.
Well, the cackles aside, that immigration point is going to be one made time and time again. And I think her other vulnerability, Kim, one of them is obviously attached to the Biden record. That's why I thought her comments about Joe Biden that we listened to earlier in the program, I suspect that might be one of the few times you hear that, because she is going to want to plow her own row. She's going to want to make her own case, and she's going to want to look forward and say, new generation, new era, and she won't criticize Biden, I don't think. Well, it's possible on some things, but I doubt it. But she will not talk about him very much.
She has to follow that path, Paul. If you look at the polling out there, the top issues among Americans in this election are the economy and inflation and then the border. And unfortunately, she is tied at the hip with Biden on both of those issues. You just heard a clip of that ad. There's another Donald Trump super PAC that is running an ad that is additionally going to argue that she was the complicit in chief, as it were, in hiding Joe Biden's infirmities. And there's some real legs to that argument. You could argue that the vice president sees the president more than anyone else, works with him more than anyone else, and she didn't say anything. I agree with you. She's going to do this interesting and clever turn where she talks about a future that looks different than the one that she just helped create, and doesn't throw Joe Biden under the bus, but suggests that there is a fresh start. The one thing that I think is a problem for her is her own record is far more progressive than Joe Biden's. And this was one of the reasons she was one of the first ones out of the Democratic primary in 2020. She didn't even make it to the first contest. And that was because she ran a very bad campaign. But in the end, what of course saved Joe Biden was his pretending to run as a moderate. She never did that. She's all in for the Green New Deal. She had advocated for getting rid of fracking, not just on public lands, but on private lands. Medicare for all, that is a place that Joe Biden did not go to when he was running. Full repeal of the Trump tax cuts with no carve out for people earning up to $400,000.
That'll change.
That'll change. And that does need to change, I think, if she wants to have a hope. But I would just point to, though, there is going to be an inclination among Democrats to try to gin up their base. And so it puts her in this unusual situation. A lot of times by this point in a campaign, candidates have pivoted. They're working for moderate voters in between, trying to catch new people. But they have a base problem at the moment that is unenthused. Maybe that simply changes because they have a new name at the top of the ticket. But there may be, like I said, an inclination from the White House to try to enthuse them the way that Joe Biden has been doing in the past few weeks by offering more radical proposals.
Well, I think they're counting on this relief rally enthusiasm driving them. Okay, we don't finally have that age issue over our heads, and they're hoping that will do the trick. And I think it will to some extent.